Resuming debate, the honourable member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to speak to Bill C-31 today, the legislation that implements the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. And as you may have heard, the NDP supports this bill, and I will be speaking in favor of it. First of all, I and the rest of my colleagues are very much in favor of strengthening Canada's trading relationships with the rest of the world. We in Canada are a trading nation. And secondly, as other speakers have mentioned here today, Canada and Ukraine have a long-standing friendship, and it is in both countries' interest to promote the peaceful ways to maintain that important relationship. And thirdly, this agreement will benefit Canadian exporters without negatively impacting important Canadian values such as labour rights and environmental protection. So getting back to some general comments on trade, we in the NDP are very much in favour of trade agreements with other countries, as I mentioned and as my colleague from Regina Louvain just said. We have supported 2 of the 3 bills on trade agreements that have been brought before this Parliament. And we support agreements that actually benefit Canadian workers and the general public, as opposed to CETA, which the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement with the European Union. It had the investor-state provisions that was just mentioned. It was going to raise the cost of pharmaceutical products in Canada. These are things that would not benefit Canadians in general. And I'm happy to say that Bill C-31, the government actually respected the usual practice of tabling this bill 21 days after signing the agreement, signing the treaty, so that parties could have some time to evaluate it, unlike what they did with CETA, when they tabled the bill more or less at the same time as they signed the treaty. So this bill will eliminate tariffs on 86% of Canadian exports to Ukraine and eliminate almost all tariffs on Ukrainian exports to Canada. So many Canadian exporters, including those trading in steel, machinery, a lot of agricultural products such as beef and pork, canola, fish, these are all products that Canada excels at producing and trades extensively in. They will all benefit from the elimination of these tariffs. We're happy to support this agreement because it has a strong labour chapter with comprehensive and enforceable provisions. This could really improve labour standards in the Ukraine. And the NDP obviously likes trade agreements that improve labour standards around the world and generally opposes those that bring labour standards down to the lowest common denominator. As an ecologist, I'm pleased to also see that this agreement has a strong environment chapter with commitments to not lower levels of protection. Again, we don't want to join the rest of the world and move things down to the lowest common denominator. We want to bring the standards around the world up to our standards here in Canada. And I and many others have been disappointed with several of the major agreements that Canada has signed with other countries that have investor-state dispute mechanisms, such as CETA, which I just mentioned, TPP, which has not come before us but has been debated here, that have these dispute mechanisms that allow foreign corporations to sue Canadian governments, the federal government, provincial governments, municipal governments, when they bring in legislation to help protect our environment or our social values. Canadians are tired of hearing news stories about legal actions that cost Canadians hundreds of millions of dollars because we've chosen to protect our clean air and water. Canadians are also in favor of provisions that protect some level of local procurement. And my colleague from Kootenay, Columbia mentioned this. When you're a mayor or council, you like to buy local. You like to promote local businesses. So it's heartening to see that open access to municipal procurements and school board procurements are not part of this agreement. I mentioned earlier about Canada's long friendship and close ties with Ukraine. There are 1.3 million Ukrainian Canadians living in this country, and Canada was the first Western country to recognize the independence of Ukraine in 1991. This agreement offers an opportunity to strengthen that relationship. As we all know, the Ukraine is suffering tumultuous times, facing Russian aggression on its borders. When the crisis developed in 2014, the NDP firmly supported the Ukraine and called on the federal government for more financial aid for Ukraine and stronger sanctions on Russia. This agreement sends an important signal to the world and to Ukraine and Russia in particular that Canada supports the Ukraine and seeks to promote peace and prosperity in the region. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to just conclude with a quote from Zenon Potozny, the president of the Canada-Ukraine Chamber of Commerce, who said, "This agreement will create additional jobs for citizens in both countries and lay new foundations for trade, growth, and investment. It also sends a very powerful message to the rest of the world that Ukraine is open for business and Canada again lends a supportive hand to Ukraine." Thank you.